speak up. So the roots of planning, right? Where does planning come from? And just going back a little bit in time, we're right in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, and you've probably heard about this. We've been here before, right? It's just that it's been over 100 years since the last time that we had a worldwide pandemic. But we've had pandemics and epidemics in New York City before, and cities and civilizations have had these life-threatening issues all the time in their history. And it's been in fact, a fact of life, a fact of societies, of cities, to deal with health crises. We've heard about the plague in Europe. We've heard about cholera and the flu. We took it for granted that we were now safe and immune, but we've been reminded that we're not safe and immune. And in fact, if you go to, there we go, there, right? This is not planning, but zoning, which is the rules that govern what new buildings can be built and what size in the city. One of the basic premises of zoning is public health, right? That's where it comes from. It's legal requirement or the legal foundation for telling a private property owner what they can and cannot do on their property is foundationally based on public health. So in our zoning resolution, public health appears over 80 times. It is the first thing that it says to promote and protect public health, then safety, then general welfare of the citizens of New York, the residents of New York. Right? And planning as a profession actually comes out of the reform movement of the late 1800s, the late 19th century. And the fact that we used to have, and we still have in many instances, have really bad unsanitary conditions in New York City. We take it for granted today that we have these things like we have public housing, safe housing, housing with indoor plumbing, but that was not the rule, certainly for lower income residents back in the late 1800s and even early 1900s into the last century, the 20th century, right? And these are actually photos of from the NYCHA archives of where New York City Housing Authority had taken down buildings before they had taken them down that show what conditions were like that people lived in. So this is part of the reform movement to try and bring sanitary conditions to residents of New York City. One of those other rules was building laws. The idea that, when you have a room, whether it be a bedroom or a living room, that you have windows with access to air and light, and requiring those to improve quality of life. And you could argue that, today you've probably heard about our emphasis on equity, social equity, racial equity, addressing that. It's a cornerstone of Mayor de Blasio and his administration. The reform movement and these laws, zoning and building laws, were in a way a version of equity, addressing inequity back in the 1800s in New York City and in cities elsewhere around the country and around the world. Right? And some of the other things that planners did and reformers did in that time in the 1800s was, as the city was growing, was to plan for other sanitation, for other health concerns, such as, where do we get our water from? Safe, clean drinking water. We're so lucky that we do not worry as much about our drinking water as other cities do. Either that it be clean, think of Flint, Michigan, or Detroit, or that we, put where we put our water once we use it for whatever purpose, right? That we take care of it, that we clean it, and discharge it in a safe manner into our bodies of water. And then something that we appreciated very much during the time of the lockdown, when we were supposed to stay away from other people, but we wanted to go outside, is parks, right? No private developer is going to build a public park out of their own volition, their own goodness of their heart, right? So the city stepped in the mid-19th century to build places like Central Park or Prospect Park, and other parks around the city, and that continues to this day. And then connecting the city within the city is important. Making it easier for people to travel within the city. It allows the city, certainly back in the 1800s, to spread out, so that at that time, before you had widespread use of elevators, you had very dense, crowded conditions in places like the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and in Chinatown, and places like that. And by allowing for people to easily cross over the East River into places like Brooklyn or Queens, you were able to actually spread out people more and create safer conditions. So the pandemic has really impacted our city, right? We are about to face an incredible hole in our budget. The mayor has already made cuts in the city's budget. You've heard the city and other cities and states going to Washington and begging for support. The MTA is hurting. We've heard about businesses closing. And obviously hundreds of thousands and millions of people around the country, and especially in our city, being out of work or impacted by the pandemic and economically, besides the very real health concerns. And I want to point out that, and I'm old enough to have at least experienced some of this. I wasn't an adult at the time, but our city has gone through a lot and survived and come back, roaring back each and every time. So even though as we come out of this pandemic later, the spring, the summer, this year, next year, the year after, it's going to be a slog. It's going to be slow, maybe a little quicker, hopefully, but we will come out of this. And I say this because looking back to the 1970s, our city at that time faced a financial crisis, similar probably in terms of scope as we do today, but it was for very different reasons. The underpinnings of the city were very different at the time. People were leaving the city all over the country, and especially here in New York. We were losing people to the suburbs, and neighborhoods were abandoned wholesale, and we were really in rough shape. And yet we managed to come out of it. And just like like we are doing today, where we're asking for help from the federal government. At that time, the city asked the then president, Ford, to help us. And he turned us down, and there is that infamous headline from the Daily News that you may have seen before, and that's a cover of Time magazine of the then mayor, A. Beam, going to Washington and asking for, by the way, he wasn't asking for money, he was asking for the federal government to simply back up the city as it borrowed money for its budget, and not asking the the federal government to actually cover, just to pay for the city, so that the banks would lend the city again if they knew that the federal government might step in if the city in fact were to not be able to pay, right? And then we were hit just after we were just coming out of this budget shortfall. We were hit with a citywide blackout that devastated neighborhoods like parts of the Bronx, the South Bronx, as well as Bushwick and Broadway. And those wounds you can see to this day, over 50 years later, or almost 50 years later. Right, and so it as a result of this housing abandonment, a flight of the middle class from New York City, flight of eventually poor people leaving New York City because they could not find jobs here, they no longer had housing or could not afford the housing. New York City actually wound up losing 1 million people in a short span of a few years between 1970 and 1980. We lost as many people in that short period of time as many other cities around the country have. Detroit today, sadly, is only 700,000, so we lost more than all of Detroit has today in population, right? But we dug our ways out of this, right? At the same time that there were cutbacks by the city and private landlords were abandoning neighborhoods, people who lived there banded together to save and rescue their buildings. And it was literally self-help. It was a bunch of people who lived in a building. The landlord walked away from it. Somebody went to the other tenants in the building, said, okay, I'm collecting some money to fix up the boiler. We need, a pipe or something else, right? And then collecting some money and fixing the front door and fixing the water and paying the electricity and putting in a new window. And these small buildings grew into community organizations that were then recognized by the city, that the city then used as it became financially better off to actually rebuild many of these neighborhoods. And maybe you live in some of these neighborhoods where you can see that. And that's an example, for example, of a building in East New York that was city-owned, abandoned by its private owner, taken over by the city, boarded up, safe from demolition, that the city then, with the help of a local nonprofit community organization, was able to rehab, rehabilitate, rework, renovate, and it is now, since then, a refuge, if you will, of permanent, affordable housing for working class New Yorkers. And examples of this are all over the city. If you go to neighborhoods like the Bronx and the South Bronx, Morrisania, Charlotte Street, in the Harlem, Northern Manhattan, in Brownsville, in Ocean Hill, in Bed-Stuy, in East New York, you will see, especially if you will see an apartment building, if you notice on the lower right-hand corner, it has a ramp going up to the front door for handicapped, disabled access, right? And you can immediately tell, if you're trained to this, to look for it, that in neighborhoods like this, you have to make the buildings, once you renovated them, disabled accessible. And the only people who were renovating, the only entity that was renovating any buildings in these neighborhoods were the city. So you can tell which are the city buildings by looking at the ramps that are in front of them. And out of this adversity grew all of these community groups, right? So the building that I showed earlier was done by a group called the Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation. But these local development corporations exist all over. There is the Fifth Avenue Committee. There are Jamaica Development Corporation in Queens, Abyssinian Development Corporation in Manhattan and Upper Manhattan, Banana Kelly in the Bronx, named after Kelly Street, which is shaped like a banana, and groups like that. And the great, fantastic thing about these groups is that they're able to do the work for the city on behalf of their communities for lower income people cheaper and more effective and hire local people. So it's a win-win for everybody. Right. So that was coming out of the 1980s. We were faced another set of adversities in the early 1990s, late 80s, early 90s, and we had with the crack epidemic, and those are crack vials, and that's a casing from a bullet that I picked up on my walks, site visits out to East New York. The crack vials had different color heads to designate which dealer was selling them. And crack cocaine, you may be familiar with, is an extremely addictive drug, and it led to a spike in crime. And we had an incredibly high murder rate in New York City. And in fact, in East New York, the murder rate was so high that you were safer as a soldier in Operation Desert Storm in 1991 than you were as a resident of East New York. You had a better chance of survival being a soldier in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq at that time, than you did living in parts of East New York. But we also overcame that. And by 2000, the city for the first time had regained all of the population that it had lost in the 1970s and 1980s, and was starting and had set a new record and was for the first time exceeding over 8 million people. And by the way, our agency takes a great deal of credit for doing such a good job by working with the Census Bureau to get the city to count that many people. And then, of course, we had 9/11 just a year later, which for a good time shook the confidence of our city because we're being attacked for being diverse, for having different groups here, for being a financial center, and for being a densely populated place, right? But we were also able to make it through there. And then finally, of course, latest is that we had Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, which devastated all of our shoreline communities and caused billions in damage, flooded every single one of our tunnels underneath the East River or the Hudson River, and really hurt especially families of lower incomes living in waterfront communities. But again, we were able to come back from that. And in fact, you can see with this chart that in periods of economic expansion, New York City is in dark blue, after in each period of expansion since the 1970s, New York City always came back a little stronger and a little stronger. And then finally, since the last recession, which is in 2008, New York City overpowered the rest of we compare ourselves to much of the region, to the surrounding counties and states. overpower those in economic growth, right? So there is hope that we are going to, once this pandemic is resolved, that we're going to rise back up again and be a successful city, and have economic growth, have jobs growth, and be more financially secure. All right, now this is the interactive part, right? If you've been paying attention, you actually get some of the clues here, right? It's time for New York City fun facts, and there is a pop quiz. And I'm going to ask you all to actually type in, when it's a pop quiz, to type in your answers very briefly in the chat. Okay, so, all right, get ready. All right, first, fun fact, right? There are 8.5 million people in New York City. We're over a third of the region, but we occupy less than 10% of the region, right? So even though we're that many people, we're extremely, New York City is extremely compact and is able to pack a lot of people into a small area, which is the reason why we are so economically successful. And the reverse is also true, it is because we are economically successful that we are this compact. And as a corollary to being so dense and being so compact, the New York metro region, even though it has only 7% of the total population of the US, our region accounts for 2/3 of all mass transit trips in the United States, right? Most of this country is dependent on cars. We are dependent on mass transit, trains and buses, as well as bicycles and ferries now. All right, now comes a pop quiz. All right, please get ready. All right. What is the greenest place in the United States? I'm going to give you some suggestions, right? So what is the greenest, meaning the most sustainable, the place where the fewest people use energy in the United States? Is it Vermont? Is it Los Angeles? Is it Edison, New Jersey? Or is it New York City? Where do residents use the least amount of energy? Which place?
Mr. Winston, can you see the chat, or would you rather me read off the
I can
answers?
actually peek at the chat. I just see that somebody wrote it's definitely not LA or New York, okay?
Oh, okay, good.
Somebody else want to type in an answer? Vermont, okay, Vermont. Okay, Vermont again. All right. I'm thinking Vermont. Probably Vermont. Okay. Wow. You people, Vermont. Okay. All right. Now remember, I maybe I shouldn't have picked Vermont. Vermont is known as the green state, but this is about sustainability and using energy. Okay. Somebody wrote New York City. All right. I'll wait for maybe one or two more. All right, Vermont. Okay. All right, here's the answer. New York. Right? This is from the Energy Administration. What is it? The U.S. Energy Administration. This is per resident use of energy. And this is ranked by state. And New York State it's actually now 50, not 51. But it's at the bottom. People who live in New York State on average, use the least amount of energy. And the only reason why New York State, our state it's because of New York City. It's that the rest of the state, we are at 44% of New York State. The rest of the state is just like every other state. But New Yorkers, New York City residents, because we use mass transit, because we walk, because we bicycle, because we live in apartment buildings that use less energy than a private house, use less energy in total per person than anywhere else in the United States. So the answer is New York City is the greenest place in the United States. I know that goes counter to what many people think about New York City because we are a lot of people and we use a lot of energy because we're a lot of people. But once you take all of that energy and you divide it by the number of people who are here in that small area, you notice that it's actually very little per person. Okay, one more pop quiz. All right. Who had greater population growth? New York City or the US? Whose population growth was greater? All right, I see someone writes, okay, I see New York City. You think population growth in New York City was higher. Okay, keep going. New York City. All right, actually, somebody wrote US, okay, trying to be contrarian. Very good to the others. Good. Could I ask, would either New York City, Asher, okay, could I ask either Asher, Emily, Myra, or Enrique maybe to speak up and just say why you think New York City's population growth was greater than that of the US? You don't want to, no one wants to say why?
Hi, this is Myra. So, I think that New York City's population growth was definitely greater than the U.S. because I think this was one of the most popular cities, and although it did have its crisis, people actually came to the city for the opportunities they were able to have. So that's why I believe they had a greater population growth.
Great. Thank you very much, Myra. I appreciate you standing up and saying that. Okay, so here's part of the answer. All right, let's see. Sorry, that didn't work. There, between 2000 and 2019, New York City's population grew by 2%. Okay, here's the US. It grew by 8 times as much. So I know that it is and this is important, right? We live here, and when we see new people coming, that is our experience, right? We see people coming here, we say, oh, the place must be growing, it's exploding. You see all these new people. It must be true. It must be like that everywhere, and therefore the population growth is greater. It actually turns out that New York City lags the rest of the country. Between 2010 and 2019, the population growth of the country has actually slowed, and the population growth of the city and the country has actually slowed since 2016. Anybody want to take a quick guess why, since 2016, both the country and the city, the population growth has slowed more? Anybody want to take a guess?
Is it like because of like birth rates are decreasing as well?
They are decreasing. And do you happen to know why? And Justin's answer in the chat is actually, and Asher's answer in the chat are actually relevant to this, right? It's because of the immigration policies of the previous president. right? Immigrants and bring new life to our country and our city, and are also usually bring children with them and have children. They start families when they're here, and they're a source of our population growth. And our city is an immigrant city, and that is and immigrants have saved our city, and immigrants have built our city. And so the hope is that with new immigration laws or immigration reform, that our city will be able again to welcome immigrants and grow again and be dynamic.
Winston, This is Toby. Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
So I'm looking at the chart with the 2% versus 16+%. Do you know how that ties in immigration versus birth rate? And by the way, that's fascinating. I wouldn't have known that.
Yeah. So in New York City, so first of all, the country overall in the world is generally aging, but immigrants tend to be always younger. And they're younger because you usually take risks like that of an immigrant when you're younger, when you're in what demographers call in your fertile years, right? And you see, usually it's the dream of an immigrant, whether it be a man or a woman, to come to the United States or to New York City, and then to bring their family here, right? Or to start a family here, right? And that is the source of much of the of our population growth. Demographers say that immigrants are very fertile because of the children that they have here. And many of you are likely sons and daughters, or daughters and sons of immigrants, right? I am. My family, my parents immigrated here from Europe when they were my father in his 30s, my mother in her 20s. Does that help, Toby?
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I would add that I'm also Winston, my dad came here when he was 3 years old, so I'm also an immigrant.
There you go.
Very helpful. And
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, one more question. All right. And who had greater job growth? New York City, the region around New York, or the US? Who had greater job growth? Take a guess. Who had greater job growth? The city, the metro region, or the US? All right, very good. I see some Yufang, New York City, Enrique, New York City, Meki, the US, okay. Megan, the US. All right. New York City, US, New York City. Okay, evenly between New York City and US. Okay, Gilbert, Asher, Diamond. All right, Dimitri, excellent saying New York City. All right, excellent, very good answers. All right, this time it is New York City. New York City had the highest growth. Here's the metro region, had 1.1%, and the US had 1%, right? So New York City, so the New York metro region, that 1.1% includes the city's growth rate. So that's why the New York metro region is higher. And this is important for a point that I wanted to make as I talk about New York City as a whole, right? What drives the population and the city's growth and the challenges that the city has to face. And there's a bonus question now. Bonus. What about Brooklyn? Do you think Brooklyn's growth was higher or lower than New York City? very quickly. Put it higher, lower. High. Okay. Yufeng says higher. Someone says lower. Higher, lower, lower. Okay. Lower, lower. Okay. All right. Lower. Does the metro region include other states? Yes, it does include other states. It includes, the metro region includes portions of New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York State, Westchester, and Long Island. Okay. Brooklyn, 4.2%, double the rate of New York City, right? So job growth in New York City in the past, since the recession 2008, has been phenomenal, right? And Toby can attest to that because Ms. Moskowitz, sorry, she is in the midst
No,
of...
it's Toby, yeah, but thank you.
Okay. Right? But our city has really been thriving in the past 10 years because of...
One second, Winston, I'm not going to call you Winston. Mr. Von Engel, we need to give you a shout out because as the head of the Department of City Planning in Brooklyn, there's been a lot of smart things that you've pushed forth that have driven jobs to our borough. So I'm very happy to hear that Brooklyn is leading the pack.
Yes, very much.
That is great
so.
news.
Yep. Okay. All right, but then, I call it a sad fact. That's sort of the end, ending on a sad note. But so, that New York City's job growth that represents 2/3 of all the jobs in the New York metro region, right? But unfortunately, our housing growth has not been keeping pace with all of that job growth. So we've had proportionately more jobs in the city than we've had housing built. And even though we don't equate necessarily every single job has to equal so much of an apartment, but you can imagine that if you create a lot of jobs in an area where people work, but you don't build as much housing as you have jobs, that you have an imbalance, right? That there are people who have jobs, who make a lot of money, who want to live in that area. And if there are people who have maybe a job but don't earn as much, they may not be able then to stay because they're being outbid by others who have more money to spend. Okay. Can I just add, did Alex join the meeting yet? Is he there? All right, maybe not. Okay. So I want to just highlight that imbalance between the number of jobs that we've created in New York City and the amount of housing that is being built in New York City as one of the reasons why we have a housing crisis, right? And one of the things that I want to talk about, that one of the other problems is that we have a very strong feeling in the city against development, anti-development. Developers are often seen as cutthroat, meaning that they only care about profit. They don't care about people. They're trying to make money every which way. They make lots of money. They are careless. They throw people out in the street. They do all kinds of things. And we do hear terrible stories about what sometimes people do to lower income, especially lower income tenants in neighborhoods. And so, but we have this otherwise also very strong anti-development fever here in New York City, right? And one of the reasons is that it's the lived experience, right? We see when we walk around, we see new buildings and new people in our neighborhoods, and we're not sure that we like it, right? It's not always like you see people now that you're unfamiliar. You see a new building coming up, and it makes you unsure about what's happening in your neighborhood. And it's that people don't like to see changes in their neighborhood. Oftentimes it's new, so-called luxury, taller buildings in your neighborhood. It's fancy stores and cafes that haven't been there before. And with it come new people who are moving into that neighborhood who, have never been there before, you've never seen there before, you just got there, and you're wondering where they came from. And usually that's expressed in, let's say, my neighborhood. I happen to live in a very white neighborhood on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And there's something about whites, they know how to organize, and to, in a very civil way. They know how to get to their elected officials, to press them to oppose new buildings. And what they express it as overdevelopment. There's just too much. We're not against building new buildings. We're just against too much of it. And they complain about the crowding on the sidewalks. They're not able to walk. Apparently, they're stuck on the sidewalk. Crowding on the subway, crowding in schools, crowding in daycare. And in other neighborhoods, they also complain that where are these new people in this new building going to park? They're going to be on the street, and they're going to be competing with me for free on-street parking, right? And oftentimes that's really what drives people to oppose new buildings, is they don't want to lose their parking space on the street, and they don't want to pay for parking either. And then they call it the impact on infrastructure. And whatever that is, there's not enough water around, there's not enough sewer capacity, not enough schools and things like that. And in poorer neighborhood, it's expressed as, and these are real fears, that their favorite stores are going to lose business as the residents move out, and that these stores will close because they get competition or they have not enough people, not enough customers. And they're afraid that the landlord or the landlady, the owner of their apartment building, will raise the rent with the new buildings coming in, or not renew their lease and kick them out, and they'll have to move to another neighborhood that maybe not as good, not as nice, where the schools aren't there, or where they simply don't, have the connection to the neighborhood. And when people don't like seeing change in their neighborhood, they want to stop. They want to put a stop to it. They want to stop new buildings. They want to stop new businesses. And particularly, and this affects us, right? They want to stop zoning changes, because zoning, I didn't explain that completely, but zoning in the city limits or tells you what you can do on your piece of land. And it was put in place in 1961, and for the most part hasn't changed. So whatever happened, whatever was there in 1961, and the population was a lot less then, hasn't really dramatically changed. And so whenever somebody applies for an increase in zoning to allow for a bigger building to be built, people resent it because they see it as change. They see it as being changing their neighborhood, bringing in new people, pushing them out. And oftentimes we at our agency become the target of the protests. We're told that that rezonings are racist because they occur mostly in poor communities of color, and that they wind up raising rents. But I want to point out, and you probably have experienced that. I would guess that probably many of you, by virtue of living or going to school in northern Brooklyn and Williamsburg and Greenpoint, or maybe even from Ocean Hill or Bed-Stuy, have experience with new buildings and newcomers into your neighborhood. But want to point out that new buildings are built where the population is growing and that population is able to pay for the housing. It's not the other way around. New buildings are built where people want to live. And also, this is important, new buildings are built when the zoning allows them to be built, right? And we get attacked often, and it's we sometimes we compare it to when you go outside and you see people with an umbrella, carrying an umbrella, and they're carrying an umbrella, they're holding up an umbrella because it's raining, right? And a new building is sort of like an umbrella, right? It's not raining because you have an umbrella. You have an umbrella because it's raining. New buildings are being built because people are moving to a neighborhood, not the other way around, right? Nobody will build a new building in a neighborhood if they don't think that they can actually rent or sell the apartments, that people are coming to the neighborhood ready to rent or buy the apartments. Okay, I hope that's so. It's the issue of and that because we have a housing shortage, because of remember I mentioned the imbalance of between jobs and new housing being built. We call it, and you probably heard this, gentrification, right? It's when wealthy residents move to a neighborhood and displace poor residents. Many equate gentrification with changes in zoning. Whenever you are upzoning or rezoning or whatever, allowing for new buildings to come in, that creates gentrification. And I want to point out that we've rezoned and not rezoned neighborhoods, and that gentrification is occurring all over the city or not, regardless of whether the zoning is in place. And examples are Greenpoint or Bushwick or Bedford-Stuyvesant or Midwood. And I love the questions in the chat. I'm seeing them, and I'll I can respond to them. Why don't I respond to them at the end? Okay, but these are great questions. Please ask them. I will address them. So one of the biggest examples that is one of the biggest rezonings that were done under the previous mayor, Bloomberg, was the rezoning of Greenpoint and Williamsburg in 2005. And it created a lot of new housing, a lot of change in the neighborhood. And people have said that this change in the neighborhood not only changed the neighborhood, but it also changed the people who lived there. It displaced them. And especially since Greenpoint and Williamsburg was or is a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood, particularly South Side, that the Greenpoint Williamsburg rezoning displaced particularly Hispanic residents and residents who are lower income. And so we were asked by the community in Greenpoint and Williamsburg to provide an update as to what had happened 15 years later from the rezoning in 2005. And we did an analysis, and we actually presented it to the City Planning Commission, and before then, actually to the local community board, with whom you might have already been in touch, right? So these are the area on the left that you see in the dark yellow and orange. The darker ones, not the lighter ones, are the areas that were rezoned along the Greenpoint and Williamsburg waterfront. Right? And what we allowed for in the rezoning, with the new zoning, the old zoning only allowed manufacturing, light industrial, commercial buildings at a relatively low height with a lot of parking to be set aside. And because industry had left to a great degree in Brooklyn. Many of these neighborhoods, many of these waterfront areas were empty by 2000. And that is why the community had approached us to look at the zoning here to see if the zoning should be changed to allow for more active uses. And that is the idea behind the 2005 Greenpoint and Williamsburg rezoning. And it was also to provide access to the waterfront. And the result of the 2005 rezoning is that, in fact, yes, it unleashed development along the waterfront. We got over 12,000 new apartments, and we counted of those some 2,000 new affordable apartments. And the city also helped preserve over 1,000 existing lower income apartments as affordable apartments. And by affordable, it is usually it would be to a family or household earning about, a family or household of 3 or 4 people, where together they earn between $60,000 and $70,000 up to that much, and they would pay no more than a third of their income for housing, right? So it's restricted. You can't earn more. You have to earn less than what, or you have to earn a minimum, and then your rent is pegged to what it is considered that you can afford. And of the housing along the waterfront, and many of you probably have seen this, this is a typical development. It's one of the first developments along the waterfront in Williamsburg. There, in the zoning, there is a rule that said that you could build along the waterfront, but if you wanted greater height of the towers, then you have to provide permanent, affordable, low-cost housing. And so, in fact, every single development that you see along the waterfront with those towers has low-income housing connected to it. And when you look at it, it is here it's separated. But if you look at this image on the slide, it is the buildings with the brown brick. That is the income, we call it income restricted, the affordable housing. That is where people of lower incomes live. And it's operated by a nonprofit operator, and you need to qualify. You cannot earn more than a certain amount in order to be able to rent an apartment there. Once you're in that apartment, you can stay there as long as you would like. And so we did see, as a result, the population increased dramatically, or significantly, I should say, in the waterfront area of Williamsburg. That's shown in that blue line. It went from about 31,900, almost to 32,000, to over 45,000. So almost a 50% increase over a period of about 10 years, right? That's significant, right? A 50% increase in population is significant. That is bigger and faster growth than the rest of the United States, right? Even fast areas that are growing in the Southwest and, I don't know, in Arizona or in Nevada. So there was significant growth in that area, of course, because of all the new housing that was built, right? And so we looked at who are those new residents, or who are the residents now that are living along the waterfront area. How many of them are, what proportion are white, and we say non-Hispanic? What proportion are Hispanic? What proportion are Asian? And we found that the proportion, the percentage of whites did not increase. The percentage of Hispanics did decrease a bit, but and what increased the proportion were other non-Hispanics, Black, and Asians. And then, so that was the proportion. And then we looked at the actual numbers, right? Because the population increased, and the what many people thought is that Hispanics, residents of Greenpoint and Williamsburg, were displaced, where there was a loss of the Hispanic residents in that neighborhood. And so we looked at the composition, not just percentage-wise, but the actual numbers of before and after. And what we found was that actually after declining up until the rezoning, the actual number of Hispanic residents went up. Certainly the number of white residents went way up since the rezoning, but so did the number of Black residents, of Asians, and other non-Hispanics. And that was actually, to us, a pleasant surprise that we did not see the reduction that others had thought the rezoning had brought. And then we looked at income, right? And absolutely, you see, before the rezoning, the median income for a household was about $64,000. By 2017, it was almost $100,000. So definitely more, higher median income, many wealthier people moving into the neighborhood. But again, did the actual number of lower income people go down? Did they get pushed out by the new higher income residents? So we looked at the actual numbers. And what we found is that from the time of the rezoning to the latest numbers that we had, that the actual number of lower income residents stayed the same, that there was not a significant reduction. And that, yes, absolutely, that higher income households did increase by a lot. And we don't actually exactly know why the number stayed the same. We think it's in part that there's affordable housing, there's rent protection, where lower income families are able to remain in the neighborhood. And then we looked at jobs, right? I mentioned earlier that New York City's job growth since 2008 had been 2%, over 2%, but that Brooklyn's was twice that of the city. Well, here it is, right? Between 2010 and 2017, the rate of job growth was about 22% in the city. In the study, in this area, it was in the larger area of Greenpoint and Williamsburg, it was 70%. It was over three times as much in terms of job growth. And in fact, in the rezoning area itself, the growth was even greater in jobs. So you could see that in the blue line that shows how fast the green line is the jobs in the waterfront area, how that went up, and how, for example, in the industrial area, in the purple, jobs started to increase as well, but not nearly as fast as in the waterfront area. And together with the rezoning, also came requirements for public open space. And if you've been along the waterfront, you walked along those towers, you know that you can now walk to the water's edge. You have places where you can sit, small playgrounds, small parks, lawns, and some of it is not always in perfect shape because of lack of maintenance and overuse. But it is a requirement, and I'm hoping that gets fixed, but it is a requirement of the zoning that any new building, not only do they have to provide affordable housing if they wanted to build large, but regardless, they always have to provide public access to the waterfront. And so we will see a ribbon of waterfront open spaces, or eventually they'll all be connected along the waterfront so that you can walk along the water's edge all the way from Newtown Creek all the way down to the Williamsburg Bridge and down to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And to date, we've had over 4 acres of open space plus Bushwick Inlet Park, which is that green spot in the middle of the slide. And so this is the end, right? We're coming to the end, yay. So the takeaways, what I said in the beginning, right? People living in New York City use the least amount of energy per person than anywhere else in the U.S., right? So living in New York is sustainable, it's resilient. We're going to come back economically, and our population is going to continue to rise. And that's a good thing, because the people who will be coming here will be using less energy because they'll be living in New York City and not in the suburbs and not in somewhere outside of the city. The other point, we have to allow for more housing to be built to accommodate that population. If we like immigration, if we want to welcome immigrants, if we want to welcome and we want to have pay for service for them, we need to allow for housing to be built. If we have children, if you're going to have children, you need a place for them to live. The other point is that the zoning dictates, it limits where and how much housing can be built, right? And if you don't change it, if you don't increase the zoning, then you're not going to increase the amount of housing, and you're going to make the housing shortage worse as people want to come to New York, and those who can have the money are able to, and those who don't get pushed out and move out, right? And so building more housing for everyone allows people with jobs to find housing and reduces the pressure on rents, right? If you have greater supply, that reduces the pressure on rents overall, right? If you come knocking, if you're looking at an apartment and the landlord says, or the landlady says that it's this much rent, and you say, you know what, the building next door was offering less, right? They will, because there is an option available to you, that's when the pressure on rents goes down. And we've seen a little bit of that happening now during the pandemic. And that's the end. Thank you. I want to does somebody want to moderate some of the questions and my answers and tell me how much longer I should go on talking?
Yes. Well, first off, thank you, Mr. Von Engel, for that amazing presentation. It was very informative. Thank you very much. Me, along with my partner, Haley Brizuela, we will be calling on the students' names, and they will read aloud their questions for you to answer.
Okay. Can you see me, by the way?
Yes,
Is
your
my screen
camera's
off
on.
now?
Yeah, it's just you. Your the presentation screen isn't there anymore.
Okay, sounds good. All
okay.
right.
So for the first question, well, being that she raised her hand, we'll go with Megan Golding first.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. Very informative. But I have two questions for you.
Yeah.
Number one, do you support gentrification in poor neighborhoods of the city? And number two, do you think gentrification will help or hinder the city's economy?
Okay, so no, right? I think the problem with gentrification in poor neighborhoods is that it has the potential to push lower income residents out, and we don't want that, right? We want to maintain, we want to keep lower income residents here in the city because they have jobs. They are, they're the people who work at CVS or that might work in a hospital or that are, work in a department store or in an auto repair shop or wherever. They are essential to the functioning of our city, right? Gentrification, though, is a fact, though, that is happening in the city. It is whenever our country is getting wealthier and our region is getting wealthier, and therefore our city is getting wealthier. If we are economically successful, that means people who have more money are coming here. And so the challenge that we have as urban planners is to accommodate the people who want to come here, both lower and higher income, and by providing them with housing and places for them to work, because we all benefit from both lower income residents as well as wealthier residents, right? Wealthier residents pay taxes. They're important because they support our schools. They support our businesses. They buy goods here that then support lower income residents. And we need lower income residents because they work in essential businesses and make our life here possible. Is that a fair answer for you?
Yes, it's a really good answer, actually.
All right. Where do you live? What neighborhood?
I live in Marine. Mill Basin. God.
In Mill Basin. Okay.
Yeah.
Very different neighborhood.
Yeah.
Okay. That's great.
But I used to live in Flatbush, so.
Okay. Very good.
Next, Gilbert Bueno has his hand raised.
Okay.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. That was very, very wonderful, honestly. So I was wondering, how do you take in things like birth rate, death rate, immigration, and just incoming residents into consideration when you're working on the zoning for a project or an area?
Right. So that's a good question, right? When we know that people are coming here, right? We know that our economy was growing, and we can see it because we see housing prices going up. When housing prices go up, that's an indication that there is more demand for it than there is supply, right? And so, and especially because we hear from those who are unable to pay rent or higher rents, lower income communities and representatives of lower income residents, we hear their call for affordable housing, right? We need more housing. My people in my community, people I know, people I work with, I live with, are no longer able to afford the rent. So we look for how can we increase the amount of housing. We also hear it, quite frankly, from middle income residents who are coming here, who want to live in a neighborhood, and we see it in the way when a property owner comes to us and says, I see people moving into the neighborhood. I know that on my piece of land I can build a 5-story building, but I'm near the subway, I'm near a bus, I'm near stores. If I could build 10 stories, I think I can rent the apartments and I can sell the apartments. So when we look for opportunities where we can increase the amount of housing that can be built as well as the amount of jobs that can be created, where it's still possible to do so. And one of the first neighborhoods that Mayor de Blasio selected was actually in East New York. It's a neighborhood that I started out in as a planner. Because in East New York, we had a lot of relatively underused land. We had a lot of lower income people who wanted more affordable housing. They were actually welcoming to the idea of some housing, new housing coming in. And we worked in other communities as well, in the Bronx, now in Gowanus, to build more housing. The one thing that you bring up, it's a fair point, which is that it is hard to quantify how much housing should we build. We can guess how much housing we should be building. I've heard a number of something like 25,000 units of housing a year would keep us apace with both demolition as well as new people coming to the city. So we're often under that, and that's the problem we have as part of this housing crunch. Gilbert, where do you live?
Oh, I actually live on the waterfront in Williamsburg.
Okay, do you live in a new building or in an older building?
Older. I've been here for a while. I think over a decade now.
Okay, and is it an affordable apartment building, or is it a market regular apartment?
It's affordable.
It is. Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
All right, so you're an example of someone who's able to stay in the neighborhood, and your rent is protected from going up.
Yeah.
That's great to hear. I love that. Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right.
Okay, next we have Sabi Currency.
Hi. Well, one of my questions is, I noticed that you graduated from Pratt Institute.
Yep.
So I wanted to know, well, I don't know if it was the same for you, but did you take a 5-year bachelor program for architecture?
Yes, I did. And actually, at Pratt had a program where you could combine and actually save a year from studying architecture to going into planning. And so I was able to, I went to a 5-year architecture program, but the last year of architecture counted towards my first year of planning. And so I was able to save a year from my education. And the architecture degree has definitely helped. Are you thinking about going into architecture?
Yes, but it just kind of like turned me off at the fact that I'd have to do a bachelor's within like 5 years. I kind of wanted to like a 4-year bachelor.
For architecture?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, look, it depends on what it is that you want to do as later in life, in your career. To become a full-fledged registered architect, you do have to go through a very lengthy process of education, which is generally 5 years, and then several years of actual work experience. You can try and substitute some of the years of education for actual work. But so, and then there are programs that might be shorter, but again, yeah, it may, you'll just have to read up on it, and good luck to you. What neighborhood are you in?
Oh yeah, that was my follow-up question. I live in East New York. I just wanted to know more about like your work in like, East New York and also like Ocean Hill.
Sure. Where in East New York do you live?
Near the 75th precinct.
Okay. On Sutter.
Yes.
Okay. You don't live in one of the Nehemiah homes, do you?
No, I live in a private home.
Okay. Sounds good. So actually, one of the reasons why I'm at the planning department is when I studied architecture and then I went into planning at Pratt in Brooklyn. We did a project with the Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation in East New York in Cypress Hills, and I got to know the planner in our office, who was the planner for East New York. And he was someone who really knew East New York in the 1980s when it was really rough, in that there was a lot of private housing abandonment, and the city wasn't able to protect people as much as it should have and could have. And he was excited by the fact that I was an intern and that I was working on this project. So I applied for an internship in the office while I was still in college, and I worked with the planner for East New York, and we went out there and we rode the streets. He told me about the neighborhood, and the very first time that the city was rebuilding parts of the neighborhood. If you look on Sutter Avenue, on Blake Avenue, you see these row houses, these 2-story row houses, newish, with parking in the front and a backyard, right? These one-family houses. When I was an intern, the city was just then planning for those houses to be built through urban renewal, as they called it then, through the housing agency. And that inspired me, that work and that planner inspired me so much that I decided to apply for a job at city planning after I got out of college and took a job there because I was being offered the opportunity to be the planner for East New York. To me, it was a real challenge to work with the people there. I really wanted to work with people there. And I also got to, Savi, did you go to school in East New York? Which junior high school did you go to?
East New York Middle School of Excellence, 605
Okay.
Shepherd.
Okay, all right. I volunteered with a junior high school 292 on Pitkin Avenue, and I met up with some 7th graders back then, and I learned from them. I learned about their neighborhood. I learned about the struggles that they were going through, and I wanted to make life there better. The neighborhood at that time had a lot of vacant lots that were owned by the city that were in really bad shape. They weren't fenced. People were doing drugs in them, were doing crime. And I wanted to see, at that time, gentrification was just like, it wasn't even a word then, really, certainly not in this part of Brooklyn. And people were just trying to hang on. And staying alive. And so I'm proud that I was able to be there for this long. And then when Mayor de Blasio came, we had done some planning work before in East New York. And we said, look, the zoning here had been in place since 1961. It was really outdated. People wanted to see more housing, and there was it was near the subway, right? You have the A train and the C train, and you have the L train, not the L. You have the L train, but you also have the J train. That these were great places for lower income families to live near, because they could easily get to jobs if you could give them good housing, and that's what got me to East New York. And you also asked about Ocean Hill and Brownsville, and that is another neighborhood that's near and dear to us. It's different from East New York. There's more public housing in Ocean Hill and Brownsville, but there's also a lot of private housing that the city helped build or preserve. And I think, the thing that gets me about Ocean Hill and Brownsville is that the public housing, you have to look at it on the positive side. It is protected lower income housing. People who live in public housing are protected from rent increases. They're safe. At the same time, and there was a gentleman by the name of Greg Jackson who lived in the public housing or had grown up there, who was a boxer, a sports figure, who said that the towers of the public housing developments in Brownsville and the wide open spaces actually made it more dangerous, and it caused the community to be more dysfunctional or to be dysfunctional. And he advocated for a revisioning of Brownsville, and I really appreciated that, because there is a way that you can, through the placement of buildings, make a neighborhood safer by creating life on the street and bringing people down to the sidewalk, what we call activating the sidewalk, and making a neighborhood safer. And when you make a neighborhood safer, that also brings jobs. that means that families can let their kids go outside on the playground and play, or you can go to school without being fearful. There are many of us who have a special place for Ocean Hill and Brownsville because it still needs, I think it can still use help.
Thank
All right,
you.
thank you.
Thank you.
We're gonna ask one more question, and that's gonna be Yufeng.
Okay.
Hello. I'd like to ask, in your opinion, how closely correlated is zoning and city planning?
That's a great question. So zoning is not planning, but zoning is a tool of planning, right? So planning is up here, and zoning is one tool, right? Planning means that you look what I showed you in the presentation today. You look at the entirety. You look at the city, you look at the region, you look at population, you look at jobs, you look at parks, open spaces, you look at transportation. All of those things together are planning. And when we planned for East New York, it wasn't just about zoning to allow for more housing or other buildings to be built. It was about creating space for parks. It was about providing more opportunities for jobs. It was about looking at the streets in East New York on Atlantic Avenue, for example. It was about improving transit. And again, one of the tools of that is zoning, right? If you plan for a neighborhood and you think housing should go here and jobs should go there, then you have to put zoning in place to allow that to happen. But the first thing that you do is you look at a neighborhood and you say, what is the right thing to go here and what size should it be, right? And what is needed in the neighborhood, in a community or in the city, right? And then you zone for it. And in practice, sometimes people come to us and they tell us, I want to build a building here. We want this district. And I said, the zoning. And I said, no, tell us first what it is that you want to do. Then we'll talk about what zoning you need. Because it's really about the project, it's about the building, or it's about the neighborhood before you do the zoning. You develop the zoning afterwards to fit your vision and your plan. And Yufeng, where do you live?
Bed-Stuy.
In Bed-Stuy, okay. And where are you and your family from?
My parents are from China.
Okay. And can I ask when they came to New York?
I think around 2000s.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Do you think, is there any possibility that we could get maybe a copy of this presentation, because this information is really useful to all of us for some of the projects that we're working on?
Yes, I think so. I just need to look through it. Please understand, don't quote me on some of these things, because but I think I can certainly share a good part of this. There was one question by Dimitri that said, even though you don't personally believe in gentrification, would you say that it contributed some benefits like less crime? I think that's a tough one. It's almost like the egg or chicken. Crime has been reduced in New York City in good part because of better police work. And I know that there's police abuse and police brutality. I don't want to be dismissive of that. But we have a much more efficient, better police department today than we did in the 1980s. And probably with the same amount, or hopefully less, racism and abuse than back then. I mean, when gentrification occurs, clearly you have wealthier people moving in. They're less likely to commit crimes, or they certainly, when wealthier people move in, or working class people move in, they certainly help stabilize the neighborhood. Should I answer one more question out of the chat?
If there's one more question that you really like, if you want to answer, go ahead, please.
Okay. One is by Myra. As a city planner, what some of the challenges you face with projects? And so, and I think I tried to highlight that today, which is it is the fact that people are distrustful they're distrustful of government, they're distrustful of development, and of the intentions and the effects, the impacts that new buildings have on a neighborhood. And so that is the biggest challenge, is that, we work with, we rely in the city on private property owners to build buildings for us. And we can require them to provide public housing, to provide affordable housing, and to provide for spaces for jobs. But it is tough when so many people are opposed to it, and that, and as I was trying to point out, is that the more we restrict what can be built and how much of it can be built, the greater the problem actually becomes. So that's one of the biggest challenges that we have. And then there was a question: what has been your experience with other architects from different parents? Do you seek to establish connection with them for the benefit to see competitive from them? So we don't, when we meet with we are public servants, right? When I hope you mean that when when you write with them for beneficiary purposes, that we usually look for benefits to the public. We are public servants. We're not in this for ourselves. We get satisfaction from seeing a building being built and being a public benefit. But we cannot, we must not, and we should never get a personal benefit, other than satisfaction of knowing that we've done the right thing. So we do work with private developers, we work with private architects, we work with city agencies as well, and we work with nonprofits.
Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, Winston, this was phenomenal. Thank you. And I just want to say to Mr. Codio, there was a question about follow-up questions, but probably the best thing is if all the follow-up questions are directed to Mr. Codio, and then if Mr. Von Engel is amenable, we could send an email, and you could either, maybe we could do a follow-up call, you could see if you have time to respond. Because somebody has to make sure that Brooklyn continues to be the great borough that it is, and we've taken a lot of your time, and I think it's just going to be too much. So let's get the questions consolidated, and hopefully Mr. Von Engel can make time, because he has a lot on his plate, and we need Brooklyn to continue to be the great borough that it is. Oh my God, you gave your email address. Okay.
It's public.
Thank you. Okay.
It is public, and
we're so great. This presentation is phenomenal. I look forward, even if it's a little redacted, to getting a copy, because this was a wealth of information. And I'm just going to give you a shout out to that great story you told about how where you really got excited and engaged in planning. That's really the purpose of this program over the last 6 years, to give our students a chance to meet people like yourself, architects, planners, engineers, and find inspiration and figure out where they want to go with their career. So we appreciate your time, and we really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, and I have to say, I love looking at the names because everybody's represented here, and